Style is all about instinct. It's all about how a director sees things. If you watch any of the directors that you admire, or I admire, or anyone admires, and you watch their work, you can see what their concerns are and how they approach things, and how they approach the characters, how they approach the world they're in. So it's instinctual type thing. A director makes movies about himself all the time, in some way or another. So, but it's finding a way to express, in visual terms, the instincts that you have, the feelings that you have inside. And I had no idea how to do that. So that taught me.
So today I want to talk more about Prince of Darkness. This is a topic that's really dear to my heart. I love this film, this film was kind of like a gateway drug into the world of synchronicity for me. So the film begins with the death of a priest. The priest leaves behind a small black journal, as well as a silver key. Another priest, wonderfully played by Donald Pleasance, discovers that the key unlocks a hidden underground complex beneath an abandoned church at some unspecified location in Los Angeles. Down in this underground chamber, he discovers another book, as well as the cylinder of pulsating, glowing green goo that we mentioned in the previous video. Understandably, the priest is rather alarmed by this turn of events, and so he contacts a professor of quantum physics named Howard Byrack, who, along with a small group of his graduate students, moves into the church to investigate the phenomena. So, right at the outset, we have a kind of coming together of science and religion. The scientific project is meant to analyze, explicate, reveal the meaning or the secret of the cylinder and of the text. One of the first things that they do is they start to decipher this illuminated manuscript. It's all a bit hard to follow, but the basic idea is that the cylinder contains something like the corporeal, physical embodiment of Satan. And furthermore, it seems to possess various telekinetic and extrasensory powers and capabilities. Everybody involved in the project begins to experience a strange shared dream, although there is some ambiguity about the ultimate source of that dream, whether it's in fact radiating from the cylinder, or whether it's perhaps originating from another source. Eventually, the cylinder starts infecting graduate students, and it's a basic kind of, knocking them down one by one zombie horror movie structure, culminating in the selection and infection of one particular graduate student named Kelly, who becomes essentially the vessel for the manifestation of the Antichrist. She then proceeds to open a mirror portal, which has on the other side of it Satan himself lying in wait, and she then attempts to bring Satan from the mirror world into our reality. A plan which is heroically thwarted in the final hour by our priest. In so doing, however, he traps one of the other graduate students, Catherine Danford, in the other side of the mirror world. And then, in the final scene of the film, it's revealed that Catherine is the ultimate source of, or was somehow involved in, the sending of these strange dreams that they had all been experiencing, which we're meant to understand was a kind of warning about about something to do with the coming of the Antichrist and the reign of Satan on Earth. So Prince of Darkness is part of John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy. It follows The Thing, which is the first installment in that trilogy, and precedes In the Mouth of Madness, the final installment. One of the interesting things about Carpenter, and something that's not generally appreciated about him, I'm afraid, is that he employs a consistent symbol system across many of his films. One of the primary elements that I started to take note of was this undercurrent of sexism that permeates the film.
Oh, I gotta ditch Pickles again. He's not gonna like it.
Sleep with him, get an A. If I don't come back, you can have my Porsche.
Well, it's an old film. Sensitivity to this stuff is much more heightened in 2017 than it was in 1987. Perhaps this is just an example of kind of an aborted attempt at comic relief that maybe flew under the radar in 87, but, hasn't aged very well in the context of 2017. And that is kind of an okay answer, except for the fact that the issue of sexism is actually directly thematized in the dialogue. There's a scene between Brian Walsh, who's basically the male protagonist of the film, and Catherine Danforth, who's his love interest. Brian is trying to flirt with her, but makes a tremendously sexist comment that Catherine calls him out on.
Every theoretical physicist I know wonders why it is that no one who looks like you ever seems to settle down in our end of the building.
That's not true, and that's an extremely sexist thing to say.
Confirmed sexist. I'm proud of it.
At the same time, I was thinking a lot about this recurrent visual motif in the film, which is this cosmic conjunction of moon and sun that almost seems to operate like a kind of frame contextualizing the action that takes place in the church. That's my hamster over there. I don't know if you can hear that on the microphone, getting a drink of water. Sorry, Pierre, didn't mean to wake you up. He's, actually technically he's crepuscular, which means that he's awake at dawn and dusk, but practically speaking, he's a fairly nocturnal animal, I'm afraid. But so remember that at the time, I didn't have any symbolic fluency. And so I had to just look this stuff up. It's like, okay, sun and moon, what does that mean? And those of you who do know about symbolism will immediately know that sun and moon are, it's basically the most primordial pair of symbols probably in the entire body of Western symbolism. And the sun is essentially associated with the masculine, and the moon is associated with the feminine. So, okay, it seems like there's an interesting kind of correspondence there, because we have this visual motif about the duality of masculine and feminine, and perhaps some kind of an integration of masculine and feminine. And then at the same time, we have this theme of sexism and a kind of light war of the sexes taking place in the dialogue. So, one of the most egregious examples of kind of workplace sexism that appears in the film is between a character named Frank Wyndham and Susan Cabot. Susan is married. We know that from a previous scene where it's established with a little bit of dialogue.
No, I hear it used to be a beautiful church.
When?
In the 1950s, my husband's parents used to come here.
Basically, Frank is hitting on her, but doing it in a very physically aggressive way. He actually positions himself between Susan and the door, preventing her from leaving. Again, it's played in such a way that you can almost dismiss it as kind of a joking, boys will be boys kind of moment or something, but if you actually closely look at Susan's facial expressions, it's clear that she's really uncomfortable. And so it's very interesting to note that, first of all, that Susan is one of the first graduate, I think the first graduate student to be zombified by the green liquid. But she also essentially oversees Frank's death, which is one of the most violent deaths in the film. Susan's kind of standing up on the fire escape, looking over this back parking lot while the murder of Frank takes place. And furthermore, Frank is killed by a woman, and by an archetypal woman. He's killed by a homeless lady who is symbolically associated in the film with the whore of Babylon. That's done in a couple of different ways. Mainly it's done imagistically. We see her holding her cup of filth when she greets the priest, and she's also wearing gold and purple clothes, which is one of the main identifying features of the whore of Babylon. Also, right after we meet her for the first time, we actually get a fragment of text naming the whore of Babylon that Lisa is translating from the illuminated manuscript. So we have Susan, who was previously wronged by Frank, overseeing his murder at the hands of a kind of dark feminine archetype. Of special interest here actually is the murder weapon, which is a pair of scissors that has had one of the scissors removed to form a stabbing weapon. And so, symbolically speaking, we can think of that as a pair, say a pair of masculine and feminine, in which one half, say the feminine, is missing. It represents perhaps the one-sidedness of the masculine, intellectual, scientific project that is attempting to reckon with this essentially incomprehensible mystery of the green cylinder. Etchinson, who remember is complicit in a way with Frank's crime.
Frankie, who's that?
Susan Cabot, radiologist, married.
Ah, how married?
is also murdered using a similar split pair. In his case, it's actually a hysterically funny scene. He's gruesomely murdered by Alice Cooper's character using a single bicycle wheel. So again, it's kind of a duality representing double wheel structure where one of the wheels is missing. In researching this sun-moon symbolism a little more, I started to read about the traditional symbolic meaning of masculine and feminine. Keep in mind that this is not about men and women exactly, it's more about archetypal principles. The masculine sun is very often associated with ego consciousness, whereas the feminine is associated more with the unconscious, and critically for our interpretation of this film, with the chthonic realm of dreams, prophecy, divination, let's say witchcraft, the occult, magic, all of that sort of stuff that is excluded from the Western rationalist paradigm, exemplified by the, let's say, the solar-worshipping scientific gaze. And so by following this trail of subtextual sexism, it actually leads us into a very interesting archetypal space. It starts to seem like, really, maybe we should be identifying with the so-called monsters, with the zombies in this film, who are then stalking vengeance on the chauvinistic, sexist, largely male scientists.
The people who tend to go to horror movies are adolescents. Kids began to identify with the bad guy in horror films and began to like the bad guy because he was the smartest guy around. Everybody else was so stupid. They just walk into a room and get murdered.
And well, there's a lot of, I want to say, kind of tonal or aesthetic evidence for that in the film. There's a lot of pathos in it, and they're not portrayed as just mindless, stupid zombies. In fact, they seem to be going through some kind of a profound spiritual transformation. All of the mirror imagery that takes place later in the film is particularly noteworthy in that regard. And so it seems that Carpenter has actually made a film that supports that point of identification. Now that's very interesting, because it's as if you can view the film from two different directions at the same time. On the one hand, you can identify with Brian, the male protagonist, and the film basically plays out as a kind of a genre piece. But if you identify with the zombies, a very different picture begins to emerge. This is really driven home, I think, in Walter's character. So Walter is played by Dennis Dunn, who many of you will probably know from Big Trouble in Little China. And he is the absolute worst offender in the film when it comes to, sexist jokes.
If I don't come back, you can have my Porsche.
And this is a very subtle note, but he is visually associated with the sun. One of the very first outfits we see him in essentially has a number of sun wheels or sun discs on it. It makes sense that he would also exhibit the most blatant sort of negative male chauvinism in the film. We see Walter looking through a kind of screen or a grill, which we can symbolically interpret as representing his paradigm or worldview. And what he sees beyond that screen is essentially his fear of the feminine, a world in which women essentially appear monstrous. And it's precisely the women that he tormented earlier in the film that are there staring at him as if in judgment. And you also see then out there, Kelly's pregnancy, and she's giving birth to the Antichrist, supposedly, so it's an extremely gory, monstrous sort of affair. Just a little bit preceding that whole scene, by the way, Walter is confronting Susan and staring at her down this long hallway. And Walter's taking a bite out of an apple, perhaps representing some kind of knowledge or wisdom that he might attain. He essentially fails to eat it. He takes a bite out of it and then throws it away and gets a beer. And then proceeds to, try to hit on Lisa.
1-1? Anyone ever tell you that you could pass for Asian?
Those two visual symbols, the tunnel and the grill or screen or frame, appear in other Carpenter films. The exact same image is used in The Mouth of Madness, where the tunnel is explicitly a bridge linking a chthonic reality of the unconscious with the solar, sort of masculine world of concrete normality. The solar and lunar imagery is also intact in that film in exactly the same way. The sun is associated with a mental institution, with kind of psychiatry in that film. And then the moon is associated with this horror writer, Sutter Kane, who is writing a book that is manifesting dark archetypal forces into reality. And then the main character in that film, John Trent, played wonderfully by Sam Neill, essentially journeys into this other realm, from the solar into the lunar. Close to the end of the film, he has to mount his escape, and he does it by running down this tunnel back to the solidity of the what he previously would have described as the real world, but of course now he's not so sure. Right before he runs down that tunnel, there's a precise recreation of Walter's closet scene, except this time he's not in a closet, but in a confessional booth. And we get exactly the same grill or frame imagery. I think the notion here is that the paradigm is shifting around them. And as in Prince of Darkness, that happens because more and more people are being infected by the liquid. In The Mouth of Madness, more and more people are being infected by the reading of this book. Eventually, it's as if the entire rest of the world has shifted to this other paradigm. And so the worldview of the protagonist, which previously was a kind of a shared consensus reality, has narrowed and constricted to the point where they're now the only person left in the old paradigm.
What's to be scared about? It's not like it's real or anything.
Well, it's not real from your point of view, and right now reality shares your point of view. What scares me about Kane's work is what might happen if reality shared his point of view.
Whoa, we're not talking about reality here. We're talking about fiction. It's different, you know?
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority. You would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world.
No, and it wouldn't happen to me.
Well, it would if you realized everything you ever knew was gone. That'd be pretty lonely being the last one left.
And so this notion of looking through the frame, it's when you're alone in your worldview that you explicitly confront the worldview as worldview, right? To the extent that the worldview is distributed or shared amongst other people, it's largely invisible. It's only when you're kind of aliasing against the worldviews of others that you understand that you, in fact, do have a frame, a paradigm, a context in which you're interpreting things. There's also an echo of this imagery in Vampires. And Vampires has a very similar series of motifs. Basically a group of vampire hunting cowboys led by James Woods' character. And they are, like in Prince of Darkness, extremely sexist.
Come on, leave the bitch! She's fucking dead anyway! Just take her!
Have you ever seen a vampire? No. Well, first of all, they're not romantic, all right? It's not like they're a bunch of fucking fags hopping around in rented formal wear and seducing everybody in sight with cheesy Eurotrash accents, all right?
Bite me, huh? Get up! Fucking bite me! Fucking bitch.
You got any bright ideas?
Yeah. We kill the whore, bury the team together, and head back to Monterey.
And again, one gets the impression that maybe you're supposed to view that pretty critically, and you're supposed to perhaps identify more with the vampires. In fact, there's even a scene where the vampire hunting crew is staying at the Sun God Motel. So, it doesn't get much more explicit than that, I would say. Anyway, later in the film, when they are kind of infiltrating the innermost vampire sanctum, we have a very similar shot of a kind of tunnel-like hallway, and on the wall of the tunnel we see exactly the same kind of shadowed projection of a grill or a screen. Okay, so getting back to Prince of Darkness, the last symbolic element that we need to unpack a little bit before we can start sort of putting it all together is the green cylinder itself. Unfortunately, gaining an understanding of the symbolic meaning of the green cylinder opens up such a big can of worms that it's actually going to have to wait for the next video, just for reasons of time. I don't want these to become sort of too overly long. So next time we'll begin with our analysis of the cylinder, and then start stitching together the overarching symbolic meaning of the film when all of these elements are taken into consideration together. Thanks for watching. Bye.